Welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I'm your host Demo, and it's time for another deck tech. This is my Kraum and Kydele Handsize Matters deck tech. This is a patron deck tech going out to I Disagree for legal reasons, one of my patrons. He wanted a deck that focused around having lots of cards in hand. He wanted to see some spell shapers for extra versatility, and he said maybe Teamer or 5-color. So I saw cards in hand and Teamer, and I immediately thought of an idea that I had a while back. You know, there had been a lot of cards recently, at least a couple of years ago anyway, that cared about drawing your second card each turn. There was a whole bunch of them printed in Throne of Eldraine, and there has been a couple more throughout the history of Magic. More recently, Jolriel was a green one that cared about drawing your second card each turn. That's actually the card that when I saw it, I thought, oh, maybe there's an idea here now. You know, we're getting more cards that care about drawing your second card each turn. So I thought, okay, all of these effects are in Teamer colors, and they are also, you know, drawing your second card each turn cares about drawing cards, which obviously is how you're going to get lots of cards in your hand. So I thought I'll go with that theme. So that's basically the direction I'm going with this deck, right? I'm having lots of cards like that, like Jolriel, like Ironcrag Pyromancer. I'm getting those effects, right? Fairy Vandal is another one that cares about drawing my second card each turn, which, you know, by the way, doesn't have to be our turn, can also be on an opponent's turn as well. If we can draw 2 cards on an opponent's turn, these effects will trigger. And so I thought, okay, I'm doing Teamer colors. So Kraum and Kydele, I have Kydele that cares about us drawing cards, right? So it's going to add colorless mana for each card we've drawn this turn. And most turns, on our turn, I would say we're probably almost always going to be drawing at least 2 cards. Kraum is going to be drawing us cards, right? So this is another way that we can get those triggers. Like if we draw a card off of our Kraum on an opponent's turn, then all we need to do is get one more, a draw effect, and then we can get those 2 cards per turn. Mad Ratter's another one, right? You draw your second card each turn, you create 2 1/1 black rat creature tokens. These effects aren't super powerful. However, it really adds up. If you're doing it on your turn every single time, and then also on a couple of opponents' turns, it really adds up, these things. You know, I have Monastery Siege. If we pick cons, which we probably will, we're going to draw a additional card on our draw step and then discard a card. So we're going to automatically get that extra draw, right? We're going to get an extra draw every turn. So we're always going to be triggering these things. And then since we're having lots of extra draws, right? Chasm Skulker is great. There's lots of these effects that are just going to take advantage of us drawing lots of cards. Nadir Kraken and Orneophage, both creatures that want us to be drawing, you know, we get lots of these draw triggers. Again, if our Kraum triggers on an opponent's step, we get one of these triggers, right? The Locust God, Niv Mizzet, both really like us drawing cards all the time and can also draw cards themselves, so they work great in the deck. And then I just threw Horizon Chimera out there. You know, why not? We're in Teamer colors. He cares about us drawing cards. I always like Gaining Life. I think Gaining Life is super underrated in Commander. And then we want to take advantage of the fact that we have lots of cards in hand. Bulwark, yeah, because we actually want to win the game, remember, right? We do have lots of creatures that we can attack with, but Bulwark is a way that we can just win the game without actually attacking. And I just love putting old cards like this in decks, as everyone knows. So at the beginning of your upkeep, it deals X damage to target opponent, where X is the number of cards in your hand minus the number of cards in that player's hand. So, you know, I really like effects, especially enchantments tend to do this, that just sit on the table and give you something. And you don't have to you just put them on the table and then just sit there. And it's unlikely, I think, that our opponents are going to use any other removal on a card like this. It's target opponent, which actually is good. I think if this card was each opponent, it would get removed real quick because it would annoy everybody. But the fact that you can choose an opponent to use this on, I think actually makes it better. You can also pick opponent, right? So you're going to pick an opponent that has less cards maybe, right? So if we have, you know, 7 or 8 or 10 cards in hand, we pick the opponent who has 2 cards in hand. We're going to deal them 6 or 7 or 8 damage. It's just a way that we can close out the game. You know, Body of Knowledge is a card. There's lots of these cards that are in the deck that are serving double duty, that care about the number, you know, it's Handsize Matters deck, so they care about the number of cards in hand This also gives us no maximum hand size, which we're going to need a lot of those effects in the deck as well. Also, when it gets dealt damage, we draw that many cards, so it's also drawing us cards. So it does lots of things in the deck. Psychosis Crawler, again, serving double duty. It's going to be taking advantage of the hand size we have, and also it's going to be dealing damage to our opponents with all the draws we're doing. Sage of Ancient Lore and Tishana, again, more creatures. You know, this is another way we can close out the game. Obviously, we can have some pretty huge creatures in play that we can just smash our opponents with. Sage of Ancient Lore is actually one of the cards that my patron mentioned, and so there it is. This is actually a pretty underrated card, you know. On the front side, it's equal to the power and toughness of the cards in your hand, so it can be a 7/7 or an 8/8. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. But the reverse side, Vigilance and Trample, its power and toughness is each equal to the total number of cards in all players' hands. This guy can be massive. This is a card that you can put in any deck, and it can be really good. If you flip it, it's like a 30/30 sometimes. Like, it can just be enormous, and you can one-shot your opponents, and has Vigilance and Trample. So good. Tishana also, you know, it has that you have no maximum hand size effect. Also, we want as many of those effects as we can. And also draws a card for each creature. So again, she's serving triple duty in this deck. Nezahal, obviously, another card that you have no maximum hand size, so there's that effect again. But also it's going to be drawing us lots of cards. This is just a great, you know, Nezahal, if anyone's ever seen it in action in a commander game, it's pretty fantastic. You can put it in any deck. It just draws you lots of cards. It's hard to remove. But we got to make sure we have lots of cards in our hand. That's the whole point, right? We do have lots of draw effects, but there's certain effects that are just super fantastic in this deck. Praetor's Council and Seagate Restoration. These are cards that can really increase the size of our hand. Praetor's Council is one. Again, this is another card that used to see so much play in the format and has sort of gone to the wayside a little. It can be really good if you wait later in the game when you have like 20 cards in your graveyard. It can be super, super good. It's particularly good in this deck because we are drawing lots of cards, which usually ends up meaning you're casting lots of spells, which means your graveyard gets fuller faster, right? Seagate Restoration, obviously it's a land on the backside, which is always good, but we're going to have a big hand, right? The downside of Seagate Restoration is you draw cards equal number of cards in your hand, +1. So if you're just using this as a card draw effect, it can be bad because if your hand's empty, you're only going to draw 1 or 2 cards, right? This is particularly good if your hand's already full, which is what we want. This is going to double our hand size, right? And also we have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game with both of these, right? So Praetor's Council and Seagate Restoration we're not going to have to worry about our hand size for the rest of the game, which is great. I really like the Magic Mirror. This is one that I don't think I've ever seen this in a game. So it costs 1 less to cast for each instant sorcery card in our graveyard, which, we're going to have a few. This isn't a Spellslinger deck, but we are going to have a few. It's probably going to cost 6 maybe or 5 or something. Again, no maximum hand size. And then at the beginning of our upkeep, we can put a knowledge counter on it and draw a card for each knowledge counter on it. So it's 1, then 2, then 3. This can get out of hand fast, if our opponents don't deal with it. I like Venser's Journal. Again, no maximum hand size and gaining life. I like the gaining life thing, right? Drawing lots of cards can make you a target. If people see you with 8, 10 cards in hand all the time, it can make you a target, and gaining 10 life is really going to keep them from killing you quick, obviously. And then Uncage the Menagerie is an interesting one. I thought, okay, this isn't a draw effect, but it is filling our hand. I think you're probably going to want to do this for 3. We have a lot of 3 CMC creatures in this deck that we want to be putting in our hand, like Ironcrag, Pyromancer, or Chasm Skulker. That's probably the target here. So you're going to pay 5 mana. You're going to go with 3 creatures you want, and you're also going to be putting 3 cards in your hand. So that increases your hand size. And then, of course, we need some spell slingers. I got Hammer Mage and I got Stronghold Machinist. These are good ones. Discard a card from your hand, counter target non-creature spell. There's also one that counters creature spells. For me, I always prefer to counter non-creature spells in a commander game. That's usually the spells that are going to be doing some serious damage or even ending the game. And Hammer Mage is just great. Just a really underrated card, We don't have a ton of artifacts in this deck. We have a few, but, discard a card from your hand, destroy all artifacts with converted mana cost X or less. That can be pretty darn good. And then Giant Ballard. Great old card. You can destroy a blue permanent, which, there's almost always going to be a blue permanent in a commander game. And then she can be an Incinerate and she can be a board wipe. So lots of uses there. Sylvan Library, obviously, I mean, it's going to be putting lots of cards in our hand. It also gets us those draw triggers, right? At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. So we don't have to. We can put the cards in our hand if we just want to fill our hand, but also we can get those draw triggers, right? For the Ironcrag Pyromancer or for the Jolriel or any of these effects, you know, even the Chasm Skulker, any of these draw effects, right? We're drawing 3 cards on our turn now. Even if we don't keep them, we still get the draw triggers. Cavalier of Gales is another one, right? Cavalier of Gales enters the battlefield. You draw 3 cards, then you put 2 cards back. So we get those 3 draw triggers off of it. I really like Credit Voucher. You know, I always got to throw cards from my 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks videos into my deck techs. This is one that I actually did talk about in this specific scenario. It gives you draw triggers, right? So you sacrifice it, shuffle any number of cards from your hand in your library, then draw that many cards. So if we have 7 cards in our hand, we can shuffle. This is like a wheel effect, right? We can shuffle our entire hand away, draw 7 cards. That's 7 draw triggers for our Psychosis Crawler or for our Locust God or whatever we happen to have in play, right? I put Rhystic Study in the deck. I don't typically play Rhystic Study. It's a pretty expensive card. I make suggestions for cards. If you can put them in, go ahead. Swap out Insight, if you want. If you want a budget alternative, maybe Insight's a good one. I like Insight. Typically, there's lots of players playing green. But Rhystic Study, because it is, again, we want to be drawing cards on our opponent's turn as well. So now if we have our Kraum in play, our opponent casts 2 spells a turn. Maybe they pay for one of them with Rhystic Study, maybe the other one they don't. So now we can get those 2 card draws on our opponent's turn. We want to be drawing cards all over the place on our opponent's turn and otherwise. Consecrated Sphinx is probably the best one for this. This is the first deck I've ever put Consecrated Sphinx in. If you watch, one of my videos where I talk about my rules of me and deck building, this is just one of those cards that was so ubiquitous in the format when I first started playing that I just hated it and I just didn't want to play it because everybody was doing it. It just was one of those auto-include cards in every deck that had blue just because it was so good, right? But it has really waned. I really don't see this card that much anymore. It's kind of wild that not a lot of people play this card anymore. It's going to get us those draw 2 trigger immediately. So on our opponent's turns, we're going to get they're going to draw a card and we're going to draw 2, and it immediately gets us those 2 draws trigger and also any other draw triggers we have. It's going to be fantastic in this deck. And then Urban Evolution, just a great card. Draw 3 cards, so it gets us all our draw triggers. Also can play an additional land each turn. So that's basically, what we're doing in the deck, a combination of we want lots of cards in our hand. How do you do that? Well, usually you're going to be drawing lots of cards, so let's do lots of draw triggers. I like those, when you draw a second card type things in decks as well, because that's kind of a neat inclusion to put in a deck like this. Make sure you put Manamo in the deck. Manamo, School at Water's Edge. This is another card, sort of like Thousand Year Elixir. I talk about that a lot if you have a commander that is tapping. Remember, Kydele, I didn't talk about our commanders too much. Kydele, we want to be untapping. So Manamo is great because we can, draw 3 cards, tap it for 3 mana, pay 1, untap it, maybe draw some more cards, then tap it for 5 or 6 mana. So it's always good to put a card like Manamo in any deck where you have a commander in blue, obviously, that you're tapping for stuff. This deck is tons of fun. I actually playtested it a couple times. I had an epic game with it. It was down to 3 players. I had been getting beaten up a lot. Again, drawing lots of cards can make you a target. So the last 2 players, one which was an Atraxa deck and the other was a life gain deck. He had like over 100 life. And they started ganging up on me because of all the cards I was drawing. I was down to 5 life, I think. And I had my Improbable Alliance out and Monastery Siege. So I was making a fairy token every turn. And I was using that fairy token to chump block the Atraxa, right? My other opponent was attacking me with his Atraxa every turn, and I was chumping with the fairy token I was getting. So that was basically saving my life. I got a Horizon Chimera out, started gaining my life back, right? And I was fending them off. Got out a couple of my creatures, my Body of Knowledge and my Psychosis Crawler, and then drew a Praetor's Council. And I was like, oh man. And by the way, you got to be careful with this, okay, if you're playing this deck. I was drawing so many cards that I was down to like about, I think, 18 cards in my library or something by the time we got to this point. So you got to be careful with that. You can deck yourself. So obviously I had like, I don't know, 40 cards in my graveyard or something like that. Cast Praetor's Council, got them all back. So I had like 45 cards in my hand or something. just a massive hand, which is fantastic in itself. But now my hand size matters. Creatures that were in play were humongous. I quickly killed the Atraxa guy, who also had like over 50 life because he was gaining life from his Atraxa, but I just one-shot killed him. The very next turn, I had my Venser's Journal out because I had played that, gained a zillion life, so now I'm completely out of the weeds. And, you know, it took me 2 turns to kill the life gain deck because, you know, obviously I had like creatures that were like 40-40 or whatever in play. So it actually didn't take me long to close out the game. It was a really epic and fun win. Super fun deck. That is my Patron deck tech, Hand Size Matters, Kraum and Kydele, going out to I Disagree for legal reasons. Thank you for your support of the channel. I have a Patreon. If you guys are interested in supporting the channel, or if you're just interested in, you want a deck tech video just like this. And for all my patrons watching this, even if I have already done your deck tech video, you still can make suggestions that I will put in other videos. It's not like you're completely excluded now, right? Obviously, I'm always going to be listening to my patrons' suggestions. You just get priority. I try to include as many people as I can. You know, I read the comments and people are like, do this and can you please do that? And, you know, obviously I can't do them all. There's just not enough time in the day. I wish I could. You know, I usually typically, if you're not a patron, I sort of just grab the ones that I think are interesting. If someone says, hey, do a Golos deck tech, I'm going to be like, yeah, I'm probably not going to do that, actually. I'm going to do the ones that I think are more interesting, or even the ones that I think really people need help with, rather than the ones that are super obvious. That's usually where I tend to go with that. But if you become a patron, it's a way that you can guarantee, you know, your voice gets heard and your ideas get used. So that is in the link in the description below. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.